Depending on the level of decentralization in a country, local authorities traditionally provide a significant share of public investment. In France, for example, almost 70% of public investment is provided by the regions, departments, communes, and groups of communes. Local authorities generally resort to borrowing to finance their capital expenditures. They constitute a substantial business portfolio for the financial sector. For the AFD, lending to the local government sector in overseas France and in foreign countries is traditionally important, with outstanding loans representing 27% of the group's non-sovereign outstanding loans at the end of 2021. However, financial climate risks, whether physical or transitional, can, in the long term, affect the socio-economic framework of the country and territory in which local authorities are located, as well as their budgetary and financial balances. In other words, if not properly taken into account, financial climate risks can lead to an increase in the credit risk borne by financial institutions, including AFD, in their financing of local authorities. How can the AFD identify and measure the financial climate risks borne by its local authority counterparts as a financial institution? What are the key elements of the local authority credit risk analysis to be taken into account in order to identify physical and transitional risks? First, we will review the fundamentals of credit analysis for local authorities, before using examples to illustrate the materialization of financial climate, physical, or transition risks. It is worth recalling some of the fundamentals of credit risk analysis applied to local authorities. The analysis takes into account the specificities of this type of actor, especially in comparison with companies or financial institutions, which are discussed in other videos of this course. Local authorities are public authorities distinct from the state, which operate in addition to the actions of the state, in countries where there is a decentralization process. As such, local authorities provide public service to a population on a defined territory, according to a determined field of competence. They are responsible for a certain number of public services, resulting in compulsory expenditure, some in operation, and others in investment. They receive different types of revenue, ranging from financial transfers from the central state to their own taxation, based on their territory of establishment. These are typically local taxation on households, with property tax, housing tax, and business tax. The analysis of the credit risk of a local authority involves several steps. First of all, understanding the institutional framework in which the local authority exercises its powers and the nature of its relations with the central state. This is an essential step as the institutional framework defines the nature of the local authority's expenditure and revenue and therefore the degree of predictability of its budgetary balance, and thus its ability to honor its financial commitments. It is also a question of judging the quality of the prudential framework to which local authorities are subject, such as the existence of balanced budget rules, an accounting and financial framework, or the existence of independent financial control authorities. A developed legislative and prudential framework will naturally tend to encourage the various actors to take the financial impact of climate change into account. Another step in the analysis of credit risk is to understand the socio-economic framework in which the local authority is evolving, which may partly determine its revenue levels. For example, a dynamic area will generate more tax revenue than an area that is undergoing conversion and whose active population is shrinking year by year. Socioeconomic characteristics also have an impact on the demand for public services, and therefore on the expenditure of the local authority. An area with a predominantly working population will not have the same needs for public services and social benefits as does an area with an elderly or very young population. Another important step in assessing a local authority's credit risk is understanding the quality of governance and its management. Forward-thinking management with advanced monitoring and reporting functions will be more likely to anticipate potential risks, such as those arising from climate change, and put in place mitigation or adaptation measures. The fourth step consists of analyzing the structure and dynamics of the budget. On the expenditure side, this involves assessing their degree of rigidity or, conversely, adjustability, as well as their counter-cyclical nature. For example, in the event of budgetary stress, it is easier to reschedule or resize investment expenditure than operating expenditure, such as the payment of suppliers, employees, or social benefits. On the revenue side, an analysis is made of the revenue basket, its degree of volatility, its more or less pro-cyclical nature, its degree of robustness or predictability, and the amending capacity of the local authority. For example, the possibility of increasing tax rates can, to some extent, offset potential fiscal shocks. Once these elements are understood, the solvency of the authority can be better assessed through the financial analysis itself. In addition to the analysis of budgetary performance, this stage includes the analysis of the debt and cash flow situation of the authority, as well as the risks linked to off-balance sheet commitments. This analysis is both retrospective and prospective, with the development of one or more prospective scenarios intended to assess the sensitivity of the debt repayment capacity, depending on one or more factors. We will now look at the impact of physical risks on local authority finances. As a reminder, physical climate risk depends on the degree of vulnerability of an actor to climate hazards. Exposure to climate hazards is determined by the geographical location of the local authority, based on medium and long-term climate scenarios. It is possible to quantify the types of climate hazards such as sea level rise, water stress, cyclones, etc., according to their probability. The analysis of a local authority's vulnerability is done in 3 steps. First, the local authority's key assets and skills are identified. Are the assets exposed to a particular climate hazard? What would be the extent of the local authority's involvement in the event of a climate hazard? What would be the effect on its financial balance? For example, the destruction of an asset may have cross-impacts on the operating section in the event of an interruption in economic activity, impacting tax collection, and increasing the need for social benefits. It can also affect the investment section through an increase in capital expenditure in order to repair destroyed assets or to address a maintenance need. Secondly, the identification of risks that have not yet materialized may lead the authorities to increase its investment budget for climate change adaptation purposes, such as the implementation of an adaptation plan for public buildings in coastal areas. Finally, the aim is to assess the support provided by the state in the event of a risk materializing or of massive investment needs to adapt to climate change. We will illustrate this analysis with the example of Cape Town, South Africa. The water crisis that affected the city of Cape Town in 2018 is a particularly good example of how a climate hazard can lead to credit risk. This climatic event was closely monitored by rating agencies and the financial community, as it was directly identified as having the potential to negatively affect the city's borrowing profile. To understand this example, let's look at some of the structural features of Cape Town's credit profile. Large South African cities are responsible for, among other things, the supply and distribution of water and electricity in their territories. The sale of water and electricity to households and businesses represents a significant share of the operating revenue, which distinguishes them from authorities of other countries. Water sales alone account for 10% of Cape Town's operating revenue. Cape Town is the second largest municipality in South Africa in terms of GDP and population with 4.5 million inhabitants, characterized by rapid population growth and, like the rest of the country, an extremely high level of inequality. Its economy is robust and diversified. It is the second financial center and port of the country, and it also has a dynamic activity in the tourism, textile industry, and trade sectors, with a large number of SMEs. The city regularly uses the bond markets to finance its capital expenditures. It uses the Moody's rating system, which issues regular press releases and rating reports on the city in order to inform investors and lenders about the city's credit quality. Let's come back at the climatic event itself. In January 2018, the Cape region is facing a drought of unprecedented proportions, with water reserves falling to 26% of capacity, down from 90% 4 years ago. What impact did this climatic event have on the perception of rating agencies and investors? The budgetary effect of the drought was twofold. The drought required the city to implement a rationing system for households and businesses in 2018, leading to a direct reduction in revenue from water sales that year. On the expenditure side, the crisis required exceptional expenditure on water supply in the short term, as well as new capital expenditure to increase the city's water supply capacity in the medium and long term. Because of this budgetary jaws effect induced by a climatic event, the financial community naturally anticipated a potential reduction in the city's self-financing margins, and therefore, in the coverage of debt service. But more broadly, the city's credit profile was also affected by the impact on the territory's economic growth, with the tourism and agricultural sectors particularly affected. The risk of relocation of several industrial companies to other regions of the country was clearly evoked. On the other hand, the potential impact on the social fabric with health and social consequences, as inequality and access to water reflects the socioeconomic inequalities that affect the territory, given the demographic growth and therefore the constant increase in water demand. The consequences of this kind of climatic event on the credit quality of a leading municipality are numerous, directly affecting its budgetary performance and restricting its investment program, as well as affecting the socioeconomic context in which it operates. As with physical risks, identifying the transmission channels of transition risks on local authority budgets require an analysis of the local authority and its wider operating environment. Transition risks can ultimately impact the credit profile in several ways. Firstly, in terms of expenditure, via the efforts to be made on the authority's assets, for example, in terms of the energy efficiency of the buildings for which it is responsible, such as schools, health centers, or energy supply, such as vehicle fleets. The impact here is an increase in the burden or rigidity of the authority's operating and investment expenditure. Secondly, transition risks can have an impact on the revenues of local authorities via the degree of budgetary exposure of the authority to the risks of transition to a low-carbon economy. For example, if the authority collects a significant proportion of taxes based on the sale of carbon-based energy, or if the local authority is heavily reliant on economic taxation, the proceeds of which are concentrated on a small number of large taxpayers, made up of industrial companies whose business model may itself be challenged by the transition to a low-carbon economy. The transition can potentially result in a loss of revenue for the local authority. Another channel of transmission, or the transition risk, lies in the support of territories in the transition in order to meet specific needs of the population in terms of services and public expenditure, such as vocational training, social support, etc. The impact in terms of expenditure is therefore more diffuse and less immediate than in the previous cases, but it can be a real constraint, depending on the competences for which the authority is responsible. Moreover, a lack of support of the territory in the transition may, in the end, prove even more harmful, leading to a lasting economic and demographic decline for the most vulnerable territories, such as the coal mining territories. In some respects, the COVID crisis can be seen as an indicator of the possible weaknesses of economic actors in the transition to a low-carbon economy. In particular, the health crisis has led to a sudden and profound change in transport behavior and usage, and therefore in fuel consumption, as a result of successive lockdowns around the world. In this respect, the situation has revealed certain transition risks for local public finances in certain regions, such as Jordan. Jordanian local authorities depend very heavily on financial transfers from the Jordanian central state, which represent between 50% and 90% of their operating revenue, which means very little budgetary autonomy. These transfers are themselves made up of 50% of tax revenues based on the domestic consumption of petroleum products and 40% of taxes on vehicle registrations. The amount of transfers from the Jordanian state to the local authorities is directly dependent on the revenue collected from these taxes. Any increase or decrease in the revenue collected is reflected in the amounts transferred to the local authorities, without any compensation mechanism in case of a decrease. The state notifies and advances the sums at the beginning of the year, and the local authorities base their annual budgets on it. In 2020, with the outbreak of the health crisis and the subsequent lockdown, the amount received by the state from fuel tax was 50% lower than estimated. Transfers to communities had to be reduced accordingly, which in some cases represented a real budgetary shock. Given that the sums had been advanced at the beginning of the year before the health crisis broke out, rather than demanding a refund of the amount corresponding to the loss of tax revenue, it was decided to convert this amount into a debt owed by the local authorities to the state. Jordanian local authorities are thus left with a heavy financial commitment to their state that will burden their solvency for many years to come. In conclusion, as public authorities exercising a certain number of competences that are essential to their populations, closely linked to their territories, and having budget and assets that are more or less sensitive to climate risks, local authorities are concerned by financial climate risks in several ways. Their financial trajectory may be durably affected by the occurrence of physical risks, as well as by transition risks. It is essential that the AFD, as a financial institution, identify the potential impact of the materialization of these risks on its loan portfolio. In particular, this means integrating specific due diligence into the appraisal of loans to local authorities, carried out by project teams during appraisal missions.